I'd next like to introduce Dr. Tianna Uchacz of Texas A&M University. Dr. Uchacz will speak to us today on the results of a questionnaire we sent out to art historians in the spring. Her lecture is titled Call and Response, Collaborative Research Among Art Historians and Technologists.
Thank you, Louisa. And thank you to our two prior speakers. That was just fantastic. I'm so excited for the question and answer period after. My talk today presents some general trends to emerge from an informal questionnaire that was circulated earlier this year among professional and personal networks of art historians, and that was designed to inform this symposium. Some of you in the audience today will have participated in this survey, and I want to start by offering you our sincerest thanks to those of you who took the time to share your opinions and experiences with us. Your responses helped to set the agenda for this series, and they also introduced us to exciting work being done in the field, some of which you'll get to see in future talks. My task today is to share the results with you. I'm going to start by briefly introducing the motivation behind the survey, and I'll then introduce the questionnaire and synthesize responses. My presentation is meant to help frame the aims of the Technological Revolutions and Art History Symposium and its 4 chapters that will unfold over the course of the year. In the planning stages for this event series, the advisory committee considered ways to build on the successes of the 2018 Symposium on Computer Vision and the Arts. Among the central concerns was the question of not only how best to feature ongoing collaborations between art historians and computer scientists, but how to seed and foster new ones. The 2018 Symposium had made clear that such collaborations were most fruitful when driven by questions generated from within the art historical community. But in order to connect art historians with appropriate technologists, engineers, and computer and data scientists, we needed to know what kinds of questions art historians were considering, or better still, what kinds of questions were they actively setting aside because those questions were too complex, because they might necessitate specialized data or equipment, because they might be beyond the scope of current analytical tools, or because the research material, perhaps insistently analog in nature, had not yet been conceived of in terms of a data set. In short, we wanted to hear what questions were occurring to art historians, from the seemingly simple to the pie in the sky. We decided to approach this problem by way of a short, informal, and voluntary questionnaire, completely anecdotal, low stakes, and unscientific, that could be circulated amongst professional listservs, social media accounts, and personal networks. The survey was framed with a few additional questions to gauge the relative comfort of art historians with broad categories of technology, their involvement in collaborative digital art history research, and the practical and perceived barriers to any such work. No question on the survey required an answer. Participants were free to offer as much or as little as they felt comfortable sharing. Now, before we get into details, a few things bear mentioning out front. Unsurprisingly, responses suggest that there was a certain degree of self-selection. That is, those who already had interest or experience in digital art history, broadly construed, seem to have been more willing to participate, though there were a handful of respondents who declared themselves largely disinterested in the digital turn in the survey responses themselves. Others objected that some questions might simply be inappropriate for computational approaches, adding that art history should not be reduced to a discipline that finds solutions using academic tools. This, of course, is an important objection, and one that many of us in this symposium surely share. Undoubtedly, art history makes critical contributions to the humanities and to culture through the way it raises complex questions as ends in themselves, not simply in pursuit of answers or practical solutions. We acknowledge the rich and varied disciplinary approaches of art historians, whose historical materials are as widely ranging as their modes and methods of inquiry. Now, with this professional diversity at the forefront of our minds, let's turn to a quick overview of the demographics of our survey respondents. In fact, the only demographic question we asked was about professional affiliation. And so we asked participants to self-identify as one or more of the following categories: university faculty, museum curators, staff, and conservators, independent scholars, students, researchers, and art market professionals. And we also left space for respondents to elaborate on their own affiliation. Roughly 25% of respondents ticked multiple boxes, which reminds us that many art historians have complex professional identities that defy pigeonholing into traditional categories as given here. Some respondents, for instance, reported working between universities and museums or universities and conservation departments. Some individuals had more complicated affiliations, working between higher ed, independent scholarship, and the art market, and others still between the art market, curation, and art criticism. Roughly 15% of respondents filled in a custom other response in order to better represent their professional activities. And I think this bears further consideration, both as a means to understand growing interdisciplinarity in general, but also the shifting professional horizons. We had art historians respond whose professional work included penning literary essays, tour guiding, and working in intellectual property law. And it seems to me that a better understanding of career trajectories, especially those that extend into the private sector, could help us identify further opportunities for collaborative research and new kinds of questions that, in fact, might be more appropriately concerned with computational solutions. In any case, the survey next asked participants to gauge their familiarity with various technologies they might be using in their teaching and research. They could respond in one of three ways: by reporting no experience whatsoever, by identifying themselves as a user of a given technology, or by declaring themselves as a creator of particular products and thus singling out a particular degree of mastery. As might be expected, there was a wide familiarity with photo and video technologies, as well as databases, with nearly 40% of respondents being database creators themselves, let alone the 60% who shoot their own research photos and videos. However, the picture changes markedly in relation to the other technologies we asked about. Between 55 and 85% of respondents have not yet had experience with GIS, computational methods, advanced visualization, special imaging, or technical analysis methods. Given the likelihood that many respondents to this questionnaire are already self-selected for their interest in digital and technical art history, we can see that there's a great potential to engage our communities further in collaborative work. Next, we asked participants to reflect on how their approach to art historical questions has changed in response to new technologies. By far, the most common answer revolved around the greater access to source material brought about by digitization campaigns worldwide. For some, it has transformed the speed of research, accelerating data collection, for instance, through the use of OCR for handwritten archival documents. At the same time that the greater accessibility of certain image types like macrophotography have encouraged not so much speed, but slow looking. Some pointed to the greater scope of research data that they can now process, and others noted, as a consequence, the ability to ask art historical questions about poorly documented or low quality works of art by aggregating such objects into larger data sets so that the spotty metadata can be queried statistically from a more distant vantage point. Others, still, suggest that increased accessibility to collections data and images have led them to research little-known or understudied objects that might have been previously unknown outside of that object's host institution. There are, however, respondents who remind us that this greater accessibility has its shadow side. The unevenness of digitization campaigns across the globe and the simple lack of documentary sources in some subfields has led to less impact on research approaches than might be expected or desired in all cases. This alerts us to a fundamental issue of inequity in the fields, sources, and objects that we privilege or prioritize for digitization. Additional points emerge from responses to this question. So, changing approaches are also being influenced by the relative ease of use for new technologies, and relatedly, a spirit of experimentation with new tools that allows for exploratory exercises to generate questions through direct interaction with out-of-the-box tech tools. Digital technologies have also impacted the scale of analysis, allowing art historical researchers to pivot between the macro of statistical analysis and the micro of microscopic records, including topics from facture to chemical analysis of the stuffs of art, that bring new, quote-unquote, visibility to features and data about art objects that are otherwise invisible to the eye. Tech tools such as fMRIs are driving advances in neuroscience of perception and thus raising questions about the historical specificity of perception and experience. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I'm a little off with my bullet points here. And significantly, art historians are beginning to shift their approaches by seeing their sources as data sets. There's also the related awareness of how computers process data, and that's leading art historians, to ask questions specifically formatted to be able to be answered by machines. One respondent gestured towards potential presuppositions embedded in tool choice. For instance, the use of mapping and network analysis seems to confirm that artistic traditions and practices were much more connected than we've generally assumed. And questions are beginning to proliferate about the epistemology of the various tech that we are developing and using, with the digital image and its technological features becoming an object of study, as well as the analysis methods of computer vision, for instance. Finally, the approaches of some of our art historians evince a concern that the objecthood of the work of art not be lost in its digital representation, and similarly, that the tech not overwhelm the content of the research. We next asked, what kinds of art historical questions do you have that the current technologies have not yet addressed? And we got a wide range of responses here that fall broadly under a few themes and categories. So the first are questions that would benefit from greater integration of existing resources. For instance, the need for customizable personal content management systems that could integrate various personal research materials, from paper-based notes, cloud notes, images, video, bibliography, to data sets. If your computer looks anything like mine, it's files all over the place and papers all over your desk. So that was one recurring question. Another is the integration of collection databases, basically the equivalent, as somebody put it, of WorldCat for images. Relatedly, the ability to link artworks, their provenance details, and bibliographic information across institutional databases to track shifts, for instance, in collecting practices. They're also interested in questions that rely on visualization and recreation of experience. So the three-dimensional recreation of historical views of art objects through AR or VR, or views of artworks that are difficult to access, or artworks that you can't move around freely, that some of those kinds of questions or needs could be addressed. They're also interested in better ways of interacting with digitized books as three-dimensional objects. Maybe not so much the Kindle swipe of the finger, but is there another way to actually bring in tactility? And to that point, additional ways to represent sensory engagement with physical objects, taking into account things like weight, texture, and scale. Other art historians were calling for the refinement of the state of AI and computer vision, because they're interested in greater or more sensitive abilities to data mine images, or to extract formal analogies across large image data sets. For instance, looking for shared gestures or poses or elements in works of art that could automatically be recognized. Others are looking for something like facial recognition for portrait heads on coins, or the ability to identify with some certainty those fundamental building blocks of art historical study, like authorship, quality, style, subject matter, and iconographic elements in work of art. Others are interested in mapping historic photographs onto extant city views to help in the reconstruction of historical urban fabrics. Another category relates to the tools for the study of art objects, making techniques, and artistic practices. So we have art historians who are looking for means to distinguish between carbon-based drawing media, or distinguish between layers of ink in drawing to determine successive campaigns in a drawing's history, or how we might visualize the back of a drawing that has since been glued to a new support, or study of problematic materials such as black pigments. Some art historians are also interested in integrating databases of technical recipes, the recipes for making art stuffs, so that they might be better analyzed as much larger data sets, or looking for kinesthetic and osteological analysis methods to understand making practices and workshop practices. Finally, we come back around to issues of accessibility. There are still questions about the need for expanded access to specialized equipment for technical analysis, an expanded repertoire of artworks that have been made subject to this kind of analysis. There's also a call for easy to find and easy to follow training for those who want to integrate emergent digital art history methods into their research, but don't know how to get started. And there's also a call for technology to be reoriented in order to prioritize the study of historically marginalized and understudied artists and their lost or inaccessible archives. To the question of collaborative work undertaken already with data scientists, technologists, or computer engineers, we can see that nearly half of our respondents have engaged in interdisciplinary projects of some kind. And those activities vary in focus. And so here's a quick overview of how project descriptions might be organized under broader headings. So we see that art historians have the ones who responded have a greater familiarity with dealing with art historical data, its development, its visualization, but they also, some of our respondents have experience with GIS, computer vision projects, crowdsourcing participation like hackathons, so a range of collaborative work. Finally, our last question was about those who haven't yet had a chance to engage in collaborative projects with technology experts, whether there were any barriers to that kind of work. And there were a few common themes that emerged. First of all, there was just a plain out no barriers, and other people who elaborated that, there's no real interest or need. That's not the direction of their questioning at the moment, which perfectly fair. But some people did identify institutional or systemic barriers, difficulties to collaborating across disciplines and across departments within research universities, for instance. In some cases, people had ideas, but they lacked contacts to help them develop collaboration. And the one that we might all be expecting, in a lot of cases, funding is lacking. I mean, grants are highly competitive, and there's only so much money to go around. Interestingly, especially in light of Jessica's talk earlier, some identified a two cultures problem, right? Like a C.P. Snow distinction between the work of scientists and the approaches of humanists. So this was also perceived a barrier to collaborative work. In any case, even among what may or may not have been a somewhat self-selecting group of respondents, we see an enthusiasm, albeit at times a cautious one, about the potential that technological advances have to help shape the future of art historical research, not to supplant traditional methods, but to complement them. Our aim in this symposium series is to help foster curiosity and a collaborative spirit that can push the state of the research forward, and we look forward to helping to facilitate that work.